Welcome to Biologica. I'm Dr. Susan, a veterinarian and a marine educator from Maine. On this show, we'll be exploring the many ways that animals and humans interact and that society and nature intersect. Please visit my Patreon or my Podbean page to support the show or to suggest future episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the episode today. Thanks for listening.
Got it. You want something deeper, more real, still for kids, but with a powerful message. Less cute and cuddly, more emotion and awareness. Here's a song that feels spoken, sung, almost like a musical message to touch hearts and make children really think. Today, we're gonna talk about animals, but not just their names or the sounds they make. We're gonna talk about what they feel, because animals just like us, they feel inside. They don't have words, but they don't need to hide. They love, they cry, they shake with fear, and all they need.
Today's episode of Biologica will be an intro to animal ethics. We're going to speak with a philosopher and ethicist from the University of Texas, and we're going to delve into a little bit of the overview of what is animal ethics, what does that field involve, and discuss some examples and some research. This is going to be one part of a couple episodes where we dig into animal ethics. And while I don't have a sort of excursion to put with this, I am going to share just a couple little personal stories interspersed in the episode where I struggled with ethics related to animals. It's been a theme in my life for a long time, and in an area where I sometimes struggle or wrestle with topics. I think that's probably true for a lot of people that are involved in animal-related fields. I'm a veterinarian, and I used to do biology, and so sort of run into these things. But I've also found, and this is where I'm outing myself a little bit on this episode, it's a little hard to talk about, but sometimes I found that my struggles with this aren't always a good fit with our society. Sometimes I've struggled with feeling kind of called out or uncomfortable with a situation in a way that puts me on the spot, going back to when I was a kid. So I'll talk a little bit about that on this episode. And if there are those of you out there that have struggled with this, maybe me outing myself and talking about this a little bit will feel familiar. And if it's not something you've thought about much, maybe it will spark thought into a new area. So welcome to the episode, and I hope you enjoy it and find it thought-provoking.
'Cause it's day.
As a side note for the music today, the songs represent different perspectives about animal ethics, animal philosophy, and animal rights, and don't necessarily represent my personal views. One of the first times I ran into an issue with animal ethics was in middle school. And I want to give a shout out to my science teachers over the years for taking me seriously when I spoke to them about my concerns and giving me alternative projects, which I think paved the way for me to go into the fields of biology and animal science and veterinary medicine in a way that I might have been turned away if they hadn't been as open-minded or understanding. So thank you to the science teachers out there who are willing to listen to and take seriously the concerns of their students. One of the first times I ran into this was in middle school, and we were doing frog dissection. One other classmate and I spoke with the teacher ahead of the class and said we felt uncomfortable. I'd always been curious when I'd found a dead animal or seen an animal sort of in a way where I could see its internal organs, but I didn't feel as comfortable with the idea that the animals had been purchased and killed for this dissection class. And so that kind of remained a theme in my life a little bit. I think I've referenced that before in my choice to go to vet school when the policies changed and the animals became donated for anatomy after they had been deceased rather than purchased for the anatomy course. It's a complex issue and not everybody might agree with me, but since we're talking about ethics and I'm sharing some personal stories, that has come up a few times in my life. And we spoke with our teacher, Dr. Wills. And Dr. Wills, for any Canterbury listeners out there, shout out to Dr. Wills, who was a fun and adventurous teacher who used to have Quaker Parrot on his shoulder. And I remember him standing up on top of a desk once and singing to us about biology. So it was a wild and fun introduction from somebody who I think had taught college and gotten over that and moved to a middle school. God bless him. So for the biology class about frog dissection, we talked to him about feeling uncomfortable about it. And he actually said that we could be in a group together and we could externally study the frog. And if we wanted to, we could walk to other tables and look at the frog. I don't know why this helped with my comfort level, but for some reason, being allowed to kind of modify the activity was helpful. There was also a worm, and we did decide after talking that we would internally look at that and found it really interesting. For the frog, we investigated it externally, and then at one point we did decide to walk around and look at some of the other tables. But I think the sort of gentleness and flexibility that teacher showed in talking with us about our feelings really was a good first experience where I wrestled with something and found kind of a middle road where I was able to navigate it in a way that didn't feel too uncomfortable. I remember that day quite vividly, so obviously it pushed my comfort zone a bit, but I think I appreciate Dr. Wills and his willingness to modify that activity for me and my one other classmate.
No thief deceive naive without trust, no greed mislead or greed without us. No thief deceive naive without trust, no greed mislead or greed without us. No thief deceive naive without trust, no greed mislead or greed without us. No thief deceive naive without trust, no greed mislead or greed without us. Derelict the Bible, take a kick a cookie, dicky dicky, suck a willy nippy, stick a straw houses, take a brick, a huff a puff, a make a shake animals like us.
Now let's go and talk with the professor of ethics from University of Texas and learn more about the academic field of animal ethics and what they look at and study. I'm here with Dr. Claire Palmer, who is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Texas A&M University. Welcome to the Biologica podcast, Dr. Palmer.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Dr. Palmer, I know you work in the field of animal philosophy, which involves animal ethics as well. Can you talk a little bit about what the field or the study of animal philosophy or animal ethics involves?
Yeah, sure. So thinking about animal ethics, which is the area that I work on mostly, it investigates questions about why we should care about animals, whether we should care about different animals differently, or whether we should think about them all the same, and what the sort of boundaries of counting as an animal are. So, should we be worried about insects and octopi, or should the limits be with animals that we know to be able to feel pain, like cats and dogs and other kinds of mammals? So there's lots of different kinds of questions. Some of them are more scientific questions where people are thinking about, what are animals actually like? And then the ethics questions, sort of looking at those questions and thinking about, well, given what they're like, what kinds of things do we owe them? And what kinds of relationships do we have with them that might generate sort of ethical responsibilities? Or when are there just times when we should just leave them alone? So those are some of the kinds of questions that animal ethicists are interested in.
That's so interesting. And I find it really interesting when I learn about fields that kind of intersect the science and the social science aspect of animals or climate change or things like that. I find that really fascinating. How did you personally get interested in this field?
Well, I guess I was always interested in animals, even when I was a child. I was curious about them and I was concerned about people hurting animals. In fact, I remember when I was at school, there was some children that were pulling wings off flies. And I remember finding that very upsetting and going to tell the teacher that they shouldn't be doing it. Maybe I was an objectionable child. Anyway, so I always had those kinds of interests. But I didn't think that they were anything that you might study. The animal welfare or animal ethics was something that was an academic subject. But then when I was a student, I came across some literature in this field where there was a very famous book that was written by a philosopher called Peter Singer in the 1970s called Animal Liberation. And I read that book and thought, I didn't actually agree with all of it, but I thought, well, this is really interesting. So there's actually people that are thinking about what we owe animals out there. And that kind of led me into thinking about doing some research in this area. And I was also interested in environmental issues. So I was working simultaneously on thinking about what kind of value is there in the environment and how should we think about how we should treat the natural world as well as individual animals. So those two areas were the things that I was became really interested in and worked on for my PhD.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Peter Singer. I haven't read his book. I do remember when I was growing up or younger, hearing some of his arguments sort of referenced sometimes. And one of my questions for you was actually who were some early thinkers or influencers in this field? How far does this go back? Does this go back to ancient times, or is it a more modern sort of questioning?
Oh, this is a great question. How many hours do you have? Yes, I mean, there always have been people that have been interested in questions about how we should relate to animals. I mean, you can go back to the ancient Greeks and find that there are texts there about animals and whether they're rational and how we should interact with them.
Mm,
But I think the sort of the thing that people cite usually as the first kind of modern intervention was it was in 1789 by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who wrote a
mm,
bit. He was a very well-known philosopher in his time, British philosopher, and he wrote a thing about animals where he said, the question is not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? And
mm,
that was seen as a sort of starting point for thinking about animal suffering. And
mm,
in the 19th century, there's a lot of legislation about animal welfare that primarily in Britain, but in parts of Europe, and more sort of philosophical thinking about that. And then in the very early 20th century, there was a book published on animals' rights by a guy called Henry Salt. And that was the first sort of book length publication that was thinking about the question of can we say that animals have rights? If we think that humans have rights, does that then mean that animals have rights? And if they don't, why don't they? Um,
interesting.
and those two questions. So I think the Bentham question about what matters is whether they can suffer, and the Salt question about do they have rights have been the two kind of most important ways of looking at the field. So there's been a group of people who are called utilitarian philosophers who are kind of interested in questions about how we should minimize suffering, both in humans and in any being that can suffer. That's our kind of moral obligation. And then a
Hmm.
separate group of people who've argued, well, there are issues about whether animals have rights. And if they have rights, then we should protect their very basic interests, like their right to life, and their right not to be imprisoned, and their right not to have severe suffering inflicted on them. But they are rather different philosophical views, but both of them have been really important in the field. Peter Singer is one of the minimized suffering people.
Mm,
And then in the early 1980s, there was a book by someone called Tom Regan called The Case for Animal Rights, and he developed this very systematic account uh, in which he argued that animals should be given some basic rights, not to be killed, not to be seriously harmed, not to be imprisoned. Um, so those
interesting.
so those that's the kind of beginning of the field in academic philosophy. That was in the 1970s and 1980s. And since then,
Mm.
it's expanded significantly.
And it seems like I know we'll get into this a little more later, but as, your interests in environmental areas and our ethical or philosophical obligations there starts to intersect with the animal interest as we start to have sort of bigger impacts on the environment that might impact individual animals or species as well. Is there a lot of crossover in those two fields of interest?
Yeah, I think it is really interesting because although you might think, well, environmental ethics and animal ethics would have a lot in common, and they do to some extent because both of them are questioning whether only human beings matter. They want to argue
Mhm,
that other things matter other than humans. There has actually
mhm,
historically been quite a bit of tension between those two fields.
mm,
And that's because animal ethics has tended to focus on individual animals and how they matter as individuals, that they can suffer or that they might have rights.
mhm,
Whereas environmental ethics has tended to focus on ecosystems and whole species and to think at
mhm,
this much bigger kind of group level. And so they were environmental ethics ethicists tended to worry that one of the implications of animal ethics was that people would want to come and help suffering wild animals because that
mhm,
seems like if you're worried about suffering, then why only you wouldn't only be concerned about farm animals or experimental animals, you might also be concerned about wild animals suffering. And so
mhm,
environmental ethicists were like, oh no, we don't want people coming in and interfering with wild systems in order to help the animals that are suffering in them. Who knows where that might go in terms of ecosystem, harming ecosystems and so on.
mhm,
So for that reason, there was always some tension. Um,
mhm.
and there have been different ways of thinking about how to deal with that. But certainly, I think that the issues about climate change as one kind of way in which humans are having very big impacts on the environment have allowed there to be more conversation between these two perspectives because climate change as a human influence is having big effects on ecosystems and on individual animals. Um,
Mhm.
so that's raising lots of questions about, well, what, because even people, even those who are concerned about environmental ethics are thinking, well, we may need to intervene to help ecosystems to flourish in this context of changing the
Mhm.
climate. Maybe we have to go in and help species to survive.
Mhm.
And so maybe that would help individual animals as well. So there are some places where there's potential for kind of overlap in thinking about how to assist both individual animals and species in the context of climate change.
It's interesting that you mentioned that tensions at times too, though. I know in college, I remember reading, I think it was an article in National Geographic, because I can kind of picture the page layout. But I remember reading an article about a study that was trying to save an endangered bird. And one of the things the researchers and activists were doing, and I think they had sort of approval to do this in their plan, um, but it showed a picture of them holding a competing bird next to a tailpipe of a truck to euthanize or kill it. And part of the program was to kill the species that was out competing the endangered bird species. And I remember personally feeling really confused when I read this article, or sort of a little thrown or startled, because I felt like a person who cared about environmental issues, but also cared about individual animals and their suffering. And I think for me, it threw my own feelings into conflict. And I hadn't studied this field. I still have not. But hearing you talk about it, I'm like, this is the language that I was lacking and needing to kind of express how I felt or understand how I felt in that conflict.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really classic kind of conflict where it's often the case with so-called invasive species, where you've got
Hmm.
Australia is there are lots of examples in Australia. For instance, feral cats are one of the issues. When feral
Hmm.
cats have been preying on native species and killing lots of individuals, but also meaning that the species are diminishing. And so then there are
Right.
questions about, well, then we should hunt and kill feral cats, and there's been a big program to do that in Australia. But of course, cats are kind of a beloved species, and many people find that really unacceptable. So
Hmm.
there is a kind of conflict, both both between, people who care about cats as a species, people who care about individual cats, and I think this is
Mm-hmm.
some of the ways that they're killing cats, like your exhaust pipe case, are pretty unpleasant. There are these things that cats go by that are sensitive to cats that they put in the wild, and they spray a poison onto the cat's fur, and then the cats lick it off, and it kills.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not particularly pleasant for the cats concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So then that does raise issues. So there's one group that's been trying to think about these issues called the Group for Compassionate Conservation. There's a Centre for Compassionate Conservation at the University of Sydney, and they're trying to sort of investigate ways of reconciling these concerns about causing suffering to individual animals in order to protect species and ecosystems.
Interesting.
And they're particularly in favor of things like using contraception and various kinds of pharmaceutical fertility control to manage populations. But of course, that also raises all kinds of issues too, as well as being very expensive. So there are lots of I mean, these are really complicated and difficult questions and hard to resolve. And they do put, people that are concerned about individual animals on the other side of some of these environmental disagreements from people that are concerned about whole species and ecosystems.
I agree. It's really complex. Like it still wrestles with my mind, and I'm interested to check out that organization too and hear about how they're approaching things. One of my questions was going to be about how and whether animal ethics and philosophy writings or thinking influences policy or issues people might have heard about in their world or in their newspapers. And I feel like we already just touched on that there. Are there other sort of examples of things that people might know from their backyard or their communities or the newspaper that really touches on areas that you and your colleagues delve into?
Yeah, I think in terms of, okay, let's reset. There are lots of different contexts in which animal ethicists might write about animals. So they write about
Mm,
animals in agriculture, animals
mm,
in laboratories, companion animals. And there's lots of work in all those three areas. And I think that there is a differing degree of influence to what's going on in the philosophical literature and what actually happens on the ground.
right.
But I think that there have been quite a few people who are engaged in animal ethics who are also working to improve animal welfare in particular contexts.
Hmm.
So I think farming is one of them. Another area would be using animals in experimentation. Certainly in the United States, there's recently
Hmm.
been a move to reduce the number of animals that are being used in experimentation. It's hard to
Hmm.
know how much that has followed from arguments that have been made by ethicists about how
Hmm.
animals are used. But that does seem to be one case where there's at least some interaction between some of the philosophical literature. And there are also people arguing at a broader level for inclusion of animals in policy making. So, for instance, when you're thinking about disaster management, you've had a hurricane or something. How do you deal with people's pets after a disaster like that? Are you
Right.
going to, fish people out of houses that are flooded without their pets, or are you going to say,
Hmm.
people should be able to take their pets with them? And so there's been a discussion about the ethics of people's relationships with their companion animals and
Hmm.
how that should be regarded in policy making. So that's another area where I think there's been some influence from some of the ethics literature. So I
Interesting.
mean, I write a column with a couple of other people that's a monthly column in the Canadian Veterinary Review on sort of ethics problems
Oh,
that veterinarians encounter. So,
so
that's
cool.
so we like to think that somebody reads those. We do get responses to them sometimes. So obviously usually when people don't like what we said, but so there are ways in which there are interactions. And I think that's really important. I mean, I've been engaged in various policy um, discussions, and I find them very very fruitful and helpful for me, both for my own work. I think making stuff more concrete is really important, but also the thought that you might actually be having some influence on what happens uh,
Yeah.
is is really interesting too. So
Well, I think it's interesting you mentioned that column, and I'm interested to find that and read that. Actually, I recently did a podcast episode from a writer of a new book called Lab Dog, and it's about dogs in research, and the writer's a journalist that talks to different groups. I think she talks a little bit about the ethics, and we got conversing about the field of veterinary medicine as being kind of complex in an ethical sense because driven to sort of relieve suffering and help animals, but also with a lot of hands in the pie of researching on animals as well, and a lot of history there. And just a side note, funny story is that when I started vet school, I came from a background of invertebrate ecology,
Mm-hmm.
and we had an ethics discussion group first year in veterinary school, and they asked us for sort of topic ideas of things we wanted to talk about. And I said in front of the group, it would be interesting to talk about whether we had any ethical obligation to sort of try to limit suffering when we used dewormers or anti-flea and anti-tick medications. And it was like a mic drop, like that. I just got blank stares, like, what? Which, as a vet now, obviously part of what we do is control fleas, and I understand how that's not a popular even question, but I thought it was interesting.
No, I think that's what's interesting is that there's some recent research. There's a group of people who work in London, and there's a Centre for Animal Sentience there.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been looking at, well, maybe the boundaries of the kinds of beings that are sentient is actually there are many more beings than we previously thought were the case, but because they're not really like us, it's hard
Mm-hmm.
for us to see how they might be connected. And so there are some arguments there that at least some kinds of insects might be able to have at least sort of positive and negative experiences, to have things they would avoid and things that they would move towards in a way that they actually experience themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not clear that would be, I mean, insect is it's not a real group. There's so many different things there, but there are
Right.
some kind of creatures in there for whom that might be the case. And so there is discussion, as you probably know, there's a movement towards increasing the number of insects that are being bred for food, say for cattle or even for people. And so that
Mm-hmm.
raises questions about, well, are there any welfare things you might need to take into account if you're thinking about mass breeding, like black soldier flies or something like that? And
Yes.
there are people talking about that. So I think it's at the moment kind of on the margins of the discussion, and maybe there's some reluctance because people who work in kind of mammals and so on are going to be, whoa, we don't want to push it out that far because that might
Mm-hmm.
affect how people think about they might think, well, this is so impossible. Let's not bother with being ethical with any animals because we can't
Right.
worry about the cockroaches and the blue bottle flies and
Yeah.
things like that. So that's the kind of worry, and the fleas for that matter.
Right.
I don't like
Yeah.
fleas myself, I have to say.
Yeah.
But
I don't either. Not in
but
my
you
house anyway, not on my
but
pet.
you can see that it might, if it turns out that there's evidence that we should be concerned about these things, then the fact that it's very, very inconvenient, it's an inconvenient truth. It's not really, we shouldn't rule it out for that reason. There may still be good reasons for eliminating them, but it might mean
Yeah.
that there are different ways in which one might do it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's one of the ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting subject. What about I read a paper of yours about sort of polar bears, and I think a lot about people thinking about animal ethics and treatment in terms of what we shouldn't do. Maybe we shouldn't do this, maybe this causes suffering or harm. And I thought your paper was interesting both because polar bears and climate change and their plight is one that really pulls on people's heartstrings. And we all have seen those images of the polar bear sort of on a melting ice floe or really skinny. What one thing I thought was interesting about your paper is it was talking about what is the ethics behind should we do something active to try to help this wild animal, either individuals or as a species. And so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that study and issue as a sort of example issue.
Yeah, that is a really interesting one. So I've written a bit about polar bears. I mean, partly because, everyone's very interested in polar bears. They're a very charismatic species, and they do seem to be threatened by climate change. Some populations more than others. So at the moment, I don't think there's any danger of polar bear species becoming extinct. But there are some populations, I think, in Hudson Bay in Canada, for instance, where because of the ways that polar bears live, their ability to feed themselves is potentially threatened. So polar bears hunt off sea ice. So they sit on sea ice and they jump off and kill seals. They eat ringed seals. That's their main diet. And so in the summer, when the sea ice melts out, the polar bears, usually many of them anyway, come into land and they come onto the shores. And then there's not really much food for them. They scavenge on things they find, but they tend to use all their winter fat while they're on the shore in the summer. And then when the ice forms, they go back out and kill seals again. But the problem is the ice is forming later, and it's melting earlier. And so the period of time that some of these bear populations are on land is much longer than it used to be. And so the bears are getting hungrier and hungrier over this time. And so there were, some studies suggesting that, there will come a time in the not too distant future when these bears would actually starve because the ice wouldn't form in time for them to be able to feed themselves on seals. And so that raises the question, well, what should we do? In a sense, it's a human responsibility that they would be hungry because it's climate change that's causing this ice to melt out much more quickly. But on the other hand, what would the implications be of anything we might do to try to help them? And there was a study in 2013 that looked at a bunch of different possible options. You could relocate them, but then all these bears, where in places where polar bears could live, there are already polar bears. So putting ones from somewhere else there is not really going to work.
Right.
There are not, so one of the options is, well, are there ways of, could we feed them temporarily? What would that mean? And so the paper that I wrote was kind of looking at, well, should we feed them? What would happen if we did? What would happen in the long term? What are the kinds of considerations? And, it is extremely complicated, and it's extremely complicated in lots of different ways. You've got to think about, well, would it actually benefit the bears themselves to be fed? Are there actually potential bad side effects for the bears? For instance, if you're putting food out for bears, are they going to meet at the food and fight one another? Are they going to spread disease to one another when they meet at the food? So there are lots of worries about feeding wildlife in general because of it being a place of disease, conflict and disease transmission. I mean, that's one reason why it's generally thought to be problematic. I'm sure you've seen all the things about birds contracting disease, wild birds at bird feeders in backyards, so on, so that's a worry. And then if you're feeding bears, you have to think about, well, what are you actually going to feed them on? And polar bears have these diets where they need to eat really, really huge amounts of fat, much more so than any other kind of bears. And seals work because they have huge amounts of blubber, but there aren't that many other animals like that. So you could kill seals to feed bears, but then that raises all kinds of other sorts of ethical issues.
Right.
Why, especially as the ringed seals themselves are being affected by climate change. So it would seem like you're killing members of one species affected by climate change to feed another species affected by climate change. So that seems problematic. You can feed them on polar bear chow, which is what they tend to give them in zoos, which is made from wild fish and from pork. But of course, you might think that's problematic in itself. And then you've got worries about, are you making the bears dependent? Would they lose their natural behavior? The scientists who looked at this studies were worried that if you start feeding bears, you're going to end up in what they call a semi-managed bear park. So you might lose the kind of wildness and natural behavior of bears. So it turns out that it's actually not, even if humans have caused the bears this hunger and potential starvation, it's not clear that any of the obvious ways of offering them feeding is going to be a good way of dealing with the problem. But if you don't feed them, then there are also worries about them going into communities, human communities, and attacking people and causing a problem in that way. So you could use food as a way of diverting them, what's called diversionary feeding, moving them away from human communities. But really, once I'd gone through all these things, it turned out to be an extremely complicated ethical issue about, are the bears going to be better off? Are people going to be better off? Are other animals going to be harmed in doing this? And are we going to lose kind of the wildness of the environment and the wildness and natural behavior of the bears? But then you have to think about all of that in the context of, well, but then if the alternative is no bears at all, is that as well as all the bears suffering, at least in that population, that population of bears, then maybe it's still better to take on some of those risks than to not feed them at all. But it's obviously a hugely complicated situation, and climate change is setting up lots and lots of similar kinds of complications. I wrote another paper about the American pika, which is a kind of very sweet little rabbit-like thing that lives at the top of mountains. The climate's changing in the mountains, but they can't go down the mountain and up a mountain further north where it's cooler because it's too warm. They can't descend the mountain, so they're sort of stuck on the top of mountains. So what do you do? Do we move them? Do we genetically modify them to be more resilient to the changing climate? Or do we just let them die out? What's the right response in these kinds of situations?
Right. And part of me feels like, and I'm wondering if this is part of the discussion, part of me feels like what the end goal or how temporary or permanent this new problem is part of potentially a factor, because when I think about polar bears and a population in a region, if you did an intervention that was meant to help them and you knew that it was to get through a certain period after which things would improve, then if it was ethically or logistically risky or complicated, I guess it feels like it could be easier to take that on if it was a temporary solution. But if there wasn't like an endpoint to the problem in sight, it also seems like, how would you do that forever? What would the end sort of goal be? Is that a factor in these discussions as well?
Absolutely. I think that's really important. And in the polar bear, and in the polar bear case, it might be that, you're basically taking on essentially making something like a zoo almost. The bears might not be in cages or anything, because you're going to have to, if it was the case that climate change wasn't improving, then the bears there'd be more and more time when they were on land and not on the ice. It would go from being a couple of weeks to being a couple of months to being who knows how long. And so you are essentially permanently supporting a population. And what's more, it also raises other kinds of vulnerabilities, because you can imagine a government deciding, having been doing this for a while, this is too expensive, dropping food from helicopters for polar bears. We're just going to let them go. So it makes them very vulnerable to political decisions over the long term. If you've got any kind of decision where you've got to keep on going, means that whoever's providing whatever it is could change their minds. But there are other interventions, like if you moved something, where the thought is that you would move it, maybe support that population for a little while, but they would find their own way in the new location. And so then you wouldn't have the kind of ongoing issue about moving.
Right. Like more of a transitional support.
So in that case, and there have already been, so in Britain, there have been some butterflies, for instance, that were moved from the south coast in Britain up north some years ago because the climate was changing, and they've established a population where they were moved to, and no one needs to intervene to help them anymore. So and that has kept that species going. So there are things like that that seem less long-term interventionist than providing food would be. Or indeed, if you, there are lots of other issues with doing this, but if you genetically modified a species, for instance, to be more resilient, so it could stay where it is, but it is more resilient, say, to cold or something like that. Maybe you could change it a little bit so its fur was thicker or whatever.
Right.
That way, again, once it's a kind of one-off intervention, once you've done it, it should be that the species could continue where it is. Actually, it'd probably be best to make its fur thinner, depending on what you're doing. But, some things like that where you could make a small genetic change in a population. But of course, that raises loads of other issues. So I'm not advocating for that. I'm saying that they're just saying there could be some interventions that are much more kind of one and done.
Right.
rather than ones
Not
that
a
entail long-term obligations.
commitment indefinitely kind
Yeah.
of. This is so interesting. I guess my last question is what are future directions or topics that you've been getting interested in or writing about that are sort of catching your attention right now?
Yeah, as ever, I have too many things going on. But I have I have been so I've been working on a project with some other people where we've been thinking about, is it ever morally acceptable to deliberately make a species extinct? So kind of it's interesting for someone who's tended to work in sort of conservation to think about the opposite issue. So that we've been working on the screwworm, which is this parasitic fly that lays eggs on animals and people if it gets the
Mhm.
chance. The larvae it produces are the only larvae that actually eat living flesh. So they basically eat animals alive from the inside by the use of these huge number of sterile flies. So that they would release thousands of millions of sterile flies that would mate with the wild flies, and then they wouldn't have any
Mm,
offspring. And that's driven it out of Texas, which is where it was particularly prevalent, and all the
interesting.
way down to Panama. But because South America is so huge and so wide, it's very difficult to carry on doing that with these sterile flies. So there's some discussion about, should we just use some kind of genetic process, to a gene drive, to just eliminate the whole species of this thing, because it's
Wow.
so terrible for animals, including wild animals, but cattle and people. But then that raises lots of ethical issues about the value of a species and the potential, what are these flies actually doing in ecosystems? Maybe there's some function that they have that we shouldn't lose. And
Mhm.
maybe species have intrinsic value that we should think about before we eliminate any of them. And so that's one project that I've been involved with that's been really interesting. It's kind of stretched my thinking quite a lot. Especially
Yeah.
as it causes so much animal suffering. You'd think, well, maybe that's a reason. But once you go down that road of thinking, well, we should get rid of a fly that causes terrible amounts of animal suffering, then you think, well, but where does that end? Does that make predation more generally a problem? What's the and I in particular don't want to go down that road. So
Some of what you're talking about with the feeding and that remind me of like the old Mutual of Omaha programs when I was a kid or that kind of thing. When you watch a nature film, and I feel like there's always that feeling of, why doesn't this photographer have that like
right,
this?
go and
And
help. Yes.
feed it, you know. So that sort of basic conflict there of like how much to help and whether you should help and what even constitutes help and that kind
Yeah,
of
no.
thing.
And in principle, I'd like to write a book on assisting wild animals, and when it's a good idea and when it isn't. That's actually my
Hmm.
next long-term project. That's what I'd really like to write
Wow.
about. So yes.
Wow. All right. Well, I'm going to keep an eye out for that. If you save my email, shoot me a
It's
link when you create that.
gonna be a while before that's done, but yes.
Well, I love hearing about your projects and the kinds of questions you're wrestling with. And um, Dr. Palmer, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It was so interesting.
Thank you. That was great. I really enjoyed it.
No member of the animal kingdom nurses past maturity. No member of the animal kingdom ever did a thing to me. So I don't eat red meat or white fish. Don't give me no blue cheese. We're all members of the animal kingdom. Leave your brothers and sisters.
I really enjoyed talking with Dr. Claire Palmer from University of Texas. I hope you enjoyed the interview. I found it really enlightening, and if I could, I think about this a lot. If I could beam myself back to college, what might I try and do? It's a little bit of a embarrassment of riches in a college campus, and I think back about sculpture classes or taiko drumming, and I also wish I could have delved into animal ethics. On that note, I'm going to share my next sort of very distinct memory. In high school, we were doing some research studies involving the classic genetics study, the fruit fly. I believe it was AP Biology, and I stayed after one day from class right before the fruit fly studies started. And I talked to Dr. King about how I felt uncomfortable with the fruit fly morgue, where the fruit flies were put in a substance and kind of crawled around for a little bit in it and then died. And I asked if I could have some alternative approach in my study. And he actually said, and I don't know the wildlife or ecological aspects of this. I don't know if these fruit flies were the same populations as we had locally in kitchens, but he said that I could put them out the window, basically let them go free. And interestingly, an exchange student from Spain stayed after and was listening to my conversation, and she came up and said, actually, I'd feel a lot more comfortable as well. And so the two of us paired together. I did really appreciate Dr. King allowing myself and the exchange student from Spain to put our fruit flies out the window and still complete and participate in that course. Later, when I became a science teacher in middle school at a Quaker school, which I did for 4 years while being a veterinarian a few days a week, I taught science 2 days a week. And we really delved into, in some of the animal and marine science units, we did do some squid dissection and we did herring dissection. But I always offered the students some alternatives. Some of the students were so interested and wanted to stay. I remember one student that was growing up on a farm and felt really comfortable but also fascinated by this. And some students really didn't want to see it at all. And so I really was influenced by my experience as a child in biology and by my teachers. And honestly, even at Stanford, I remember a couple times indicating that I felt uncomfortable with an activity that was planned in a biology course and being given a paper or a research topic as an alternative. It may have been different in some settings or in some eras, but I found that while socially uncomfortable, I had to sort of step up and single myself out. I also felt that the science educators I interacted with were always very open to having a conversation and modifying an activity. So I thank them for that. Those are just a couple personal stories over the years of things I dealt with in the world of animal ethics, and I'd be really interested to hear your stories. I know as a veterinarian, we deal with ethical challenges and situations quite often, also in a shelter setting. And the people that do work in those fields care so much about animals. But we're also often put into situations where finances and the animals' needs and society's needs, all these things are interacting in very complex ways. And we're actually going to have an episode soon where I spoke with an animal ethicist delving into more about the pet world and dog ownership. And she has a very interesting and European perspective on that will be fun to share with you. If you have had experiences, and I'd love to hear about them personally on my Facebook page or Instagram page or at biologica.podcast@gmail.com, and would love to have a little conversation. Thank you again for joining us for today's exploration of animal ethics and animal philosophy and kind of an intro to that. And we will look forward to digging into it a little further in future episodes. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please share it on your social media or send an email to a friend. In between my full-time job and creating the podcasts, I don't often have much time left for that. So I appreciate everybody out there that helps spread the word and keep it rolling. I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. And in the meantime, please keep discovering.
This beautiful creature must die, a death for no reason.